Each year, Burning Man, the famed and occasionally notorious week-long festival, cannot operate unless it gets a signature on this short document. After all, the festival occurs here on the vast, barren playa of the Black Rock Desert, land that doesn't belong to Burning Man itself, but to the United States. It's public land, managed by an agency called the Bureau of Land Management. So, in order for this massive 880,000-person festival to take place, this permit needs the signature of the manager of the BLM's Black Rock Field Office. And securing that signature, it's a fragile, tense process. There's so much on the line. The Black Rock Desert is part of a national conservation area. That means the BLM demands that the festival disappear without a trace. Imagine it, 880,000 people descending upon this remote land. Yet when they leave, it must look as though they were never there. No footprints, no waste. It's almost impossible to fathom. Each year, Burning Man must clean the playa to the point that on any given acre of land, there's no more than 1 square foot of remaining trash. To ensure this, the BLM randomly selects 120 out of the event's 3,883 acres, then sends out teams to inspect and, if necessary, clean. They actually go out, boots in the dirt, picking up any remaining trash. Then they take it back to their field office, spread it on a green background, and photograph it. With the help of Photoshop, they measure the square footage of the trash. Just like this example, 0.264 square feet. That acre passed the test. But in 2023, after an unusually rainy season that left the festival in a muddy mess, Burning Man barely scraped by. 11 of the 120 points failed. Just 11. They're allowed to fail 12, but if they'd exceeded that, their permit for 2024 could have been yanked. The stakes were that high. But what's even more striking than this near miss is the enormity of the agency tasked with regulating this temporary, world-famous 80,000-person city. The Black Rock Desert is part of the BLM's Wukah District, which is headquartered in a humble single-story office building in Winnemucca, Nevada. That's it. That's the entire physical presence of the district, along with a small facility in Gerlach, Nevada, far closer to the Black Rock Desert. But that's it. This small, obscure government agency oversees 8.2 million acres of land. Let that sink in. That's more land than the entire country of Qatar. A staggering amount. A collection of land that adds up to 75% of the entire land mass within the Weinmuck district. How did such a small agency come to shoulder such a colossal task? The answer is simple, yet profound. When the United States conquered and settled the West, all the land was originally owned by the federal government, at least according to the federal government. That's when this land was allocated to different purposes, and the BLM became its custodian. Owners and users, a delicate balance. For example, this stretch of Nevada near the Black Rock Desert was earmarked as the best route for the first transcontinental railroad, due to its comparatively tame geography. Can you feel the weight of history here? The federal government incentivized the Central Pacific Railroad Company to build the rails by giving it every other square mile of land in a band around the track. The thought was that they'd eventually be able to sell much of that land, which would become more valuable with the construction of the railroad. So today, more than a century later, these tracks are held by various private landowners. It's almost as if time has painted over the original intentions, leaving behind a legacy that stretches across generations. Private land ownership was also established here in the town of Fallon. This area started as a ranch owned by Mike and Elisa Fallon, a couple with big dreams. They likely claimed the land through the rights established by the Homestead Acts, which allowed settlers to get up to 160 acres of land in these western states for a nominal fee, as long as they cultivated and lived on it for 6 months. Eventually, Mike and Elisa Fallon caught wind of a groundbreaking project by the newly formed Bureau of Reclamation, the creation of an irrigation infrastructure that would allow farming in this dry desert region. It was the hope of the land, the promise of transformation. And so, they sold their ranch to a land developer who split it into smaller chunks, and thus the town of Fallon was born. That Bureau of Reclamation project, it did eventually happen, and as part of it, the agency was given ownership of land around the farmland, rivers, and relevant infrastructure. But that's not where the story ends. Simultaneously, the very waterways that the Bureau of Reclamation was manipulating were identified as crucial habitats. for migratory birds. So, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service took over portions of land to turn them into the Fallon and Stillwater National Wildlife Refuges. These areas would remain untouched, safeguarded for wildlife. And then, with the outbreak of World War II, the Fallon Naval Air Station was built. The stakes grew higher. This land was handed over to the Department of Defense, which turned it into the Fallon Range Training Complex. Vast, empty stretches of desert where pilots could train with actual live weapons. War had a way of carving its own path across the land. And finally, this area near town was transferred to the Bureau of Indian Affairs to be held in trust for the Fallon Paiute Shoshone Reservation. This land became a bridge to the past, to the indigenous communities who had always called it home. That was the extent of land allocation, but all this was still left. So, what does it mean if land wasn't valuable enough for settlers to claim it? If it wasn't crucial enough for the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, or even the Department of Defense, then that's when the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, took over. The BLM manages what's left, the land deemed as America's worst land. It's the land of least utility to both humans and animals. But even if it is America's most useless land, that doesn't mean it's worthless. As the American West has developed and grown in population, both humans and animals have found plenty of use for the land the BLM manages. At the same time, BLM land is the least regulated public land in America. It's freedom in its rawest form. If you want to camp on it, you can free for up to 14 days. If you want to collect rocks and fossils and take them home, you can free as long as you're not selling them. Want to let your cattle graze? Build an electric transmission line? Construct a coal mine? Or an oil rig on BLM land? It's possible with the proper permits, of course. And if you want to set up a temporary city for 880,000 people on a conserved ancient lake, well, it seems you can do that too. Simultaneously, BLM land is the least regulated public land in America. Freedom exists here, but with its own rules. But there's a catch, because Burning Man takes two diametrically opposed land use concepts, conserved nature and bustling city, and merges them year after year. There's a lot of hoops to jump through. It's not just a festival, it's a city that rises from the desert sands and just as quickly disappears, not long after the trash samples are taken. The process of organizing the next year's Burning Man begins anew, starting with the post-event cooperators meeting. The title's apartment, while it's BLM land, and therefore BLM's rules, building a city, then vanishing it, is a monumental lift. This is overseen by the Federal Bureau with the assistance of county officials, but is undertaken almost exclusively by the Burning Man Project, the festival's official operator, and its army of volunteers and staff. Out of this cooperators meeting between land managers and land users comes a document like this. The additional stipulations, a list of new rules layered on top of what's already established in the 29302 Special Recreation Permit. And, of course, this permit in turn is informed by the findings of the Environmental Impact Statement, which was initiated in 2017 and completed in 2019 by the BLM. That report runs hundreds of pages across multiple volumes. It's an immense amount of work. Just getting the paperwork in order is a bear. But that's only the beginning. There's also the task of upholding the rules outlined in this paperwork. For this, the BLM calls for backup. As a federal land management agency, the BLM does have a policing arm, the BLM Law Enforcement Rangers, but there are only 200 of them nationwide, and only 2 in this particular region of remote Nevada. So, to staff Burning Man, where in recent years they've called for more than a third of the force to be present, they go national, bringing in rangers from Wyoming, California, and Colorado. Many of them become annual fixtures at the event. Still, even then, that's not quite enough. So, the BLM partners with the Nevada Highway Patrol and the Pershing County Sheriff's Office to toll out citations, tickets, and make the occasional arrest. But the multifaceted Bureau does more than just police. Each year, for instance, among the thousands of extravagant setups, there's this humble tent called the Interp Camp, where employed specialists monitor air quality, and public-facing recreation and visitor service staff set up tables and posters to inform the public on the geological and cultural history of the landscape upon which they're standing. At the end of the festival, the BLM again appears in another capacity, as BLM officials train and oversee volunteers on how to properly take trash samples. From paperwork to litter picking and law enforcement, the BLM is there every step of the way. While intuitive as it is, managing the land they maintain is a monumental undertaking for a regional office that, as recently as 2022, only had 5 specialist employees. But the BLM doesn't have much of a choice in the matter to begin with. With the nearly $3 million in annual fees for the event, the BLM allows this use for a more fundamental reason, because it has to. You see, all this Black Rock Desert land became conservation land in 2000 with the passage of specific legislation. But the rules on access and use, well, they're a little light on detail. Essentially, it can be used as long as it's not damaged too much for future use, and it can host large, permanent events, as long as it doesn't offend the Management Plan or the Management Act of 1976. This Management Act, which has come to guide how the BLM operates today, is also largely open to interpretation. It declares that public land is to be managed on the basis of multiple use and sustained yield. The goal is to protect this land for future generations, but also to serve the public's needs in the present. It's a delicate balance, but it's also vague and contradictory. This confusion has created room for cities on conservation land and a whole host of other odd outgrowths. And when you combine that vague mandate with a Congress and executive branch that needs someone to follow through on their orders, the BLM ends up with a dizzying array of tasks, many of which contradict each other. For example, in 1971, Congress addressed long-running concerns from animal welfare advocates and passed the Wild and Free-Roaming Horse and Burros Act. The name is a bit of a misnomer, though. Horses and burros are domesticated animals, meaning they can't truly be wild. But through the years, plenty of them escaped or were set free, and now they roam across the West, multiplying at a pest-like rate. Ranchers hated this. The horses were ferocious grazers, devouring the land that would otherwise sustain their cattle. But the act declared them to be living symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West, and therefore the BLM was tasked with protecting them, often against ranchers. To do so, they established 270 herd management areas, where vast tracts of federal land are specifically managed for the benefit of these horses and burros. The BLM also determined that the sustainable nationwide population of wild horses and burros should be around 26,690. But the current population is over 880,000. And that's not something they can fix easily. They can't just kill the horses, so when a herd is overpopulated, they use a helicopter to corral them into a trap. From there, some horses get birth control to limit population growth, while others are sent to off-range pastures. Many of these pastures are near prisons, where inmates train the horses so they can eventually be adopted and live out their lives as non-wild horses. But that's just the start of the endless list of BLM tasks. For example, the BLM is also responsible for protecting 20,000 rocks in California. These rocks are part of the California Coastal National Monument, which primarily protects not the land on the coast, but the islets, reefs, and rock outcroppings just off the coast. And it's the BLM's job to manage this national monument. The BLM is also responsible for making about 50,000 old mines safe. These mines, poorly documented and quickly abandoned during the gold rush, are scattered across the West, dangerous and unstable. The risks are real. A person could fall into a mine shaft, get crushed in a cave-in, accidentally detonate an old explosive, breathe in deadly gases, suffocate from a lack of oxygen, get lost while exploring, or just walk across unstable land that caves in. These aren't just theoretical threats. Dozens of people die from these risks every year. And so, the BLM is tasked with fixing these old mines, trying to mitigate the dangers. But that's not all. Congress also told the BLM to figure out good routes for electric lines and pipelines. So they did. They figured it out, as the BLM is tasked with managing virtually all federal mineral rights, which are enormous. You see, the BLM doesn't just manage oil and gas leasing on all federal land, even the Forest Service land. They also handle what are called split estates. When the federal government allocated land in the West, much of it was under the stipulation that the federal government retained the subsurface mineral rights to much of the land, meaning the BLM now manages almost 30% of the U.S.'s landmass for the extraction of minerals. This has put them at the center of endless controversy over oil, gas, and mining leasing on federal land. But the BLM has been used to controversy since its inception, tasked with solving the tragedy of the commons. In the early days, when Americans first settled the West, ranchers raised cattle, sheep, and livestock through open grazing, essentially letting their animals roam freely on federal land, consuming any wild plants they could find. This practice was allowed, but it eventually led to overgrazed land, and the cattle populations collapsed because there wasn't enough forage to sustain them. So in the 1930s, Congress passed the Taylor Grazing Act, which started regulating ranching on federal land. This led to the establishment of the Grazing Service, which eventually merged with the General Land Office to become the Bureau of Land Management. Today, the BLM administers 18,000 permits for livestock grazing. These permits are granted to ranchers with valid base property near BLM land, and in exchange, ranchers pay a fee of $1.35 per animal unit per month. This means they pay just $1.35 each month to graze one horse on federal land. This fee is shockingly low, even when adjusting for inflation. It's less than the $2.31 per animal unit per month from 1981. And compared to the free market, the fee is a steal. Grazing on private land costs about $23 per animal. This makes BLM grazing permits incredibly valuable. Much like water rights, land in the West sells for exorbitant prices if it includes grazing rights. And any threat to this ability to graze on federal land is considered a crisis, an existential threat. This crisis reached its peak in 2016, when a group of radical right-wing ranchers stormed and occupied the headquarters of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge for 40 days. This standoff ended with a death and 27 federal indictments, all stemming from a dispute that had been centuries in the making. The Malheur Refuge had been a federally protected bird sanctuary since 1908. But the land between the refuge and BLM land had been the Hammond Homestead Ranch since the 1870s. For years, these parties coexisted relatively peacefully. The cattle from the Hammond Ranch were allowed to graze on refuge land without much fuss. But that changed in 1994, when Fish and Wildlife wanted to build a fence to protect the fragile Perron ecosystem, land that had been overgrazed for too long. Suddenly, the Hammond family saw this as a privilege being taken away, a right they had enjoyed for generations. The patriarch, Dwight Hammond, escalated the situation by issuing death threats toward federal employees. When his threats failed to bring results, he and his son physically blocked the construction of the fence by parking heavy machinery in its path, refusing to back down. The Hammonds were arrested, but their actions sparked a movement. Their neighbors and allies in Burns, Oregon, rallied behind them. Local businesses posted signs refusing to serve federal agents. The district representative even protested the arrests. And to this group, federal control over what they saw as their land was an affront to their way of life. After their release, the Hammonds didn't back down. In 1999, they set a fire on the refuge that spilled onto BLM land. Then, in 2001, they allegedly started another fire to conceal evidence of illegal deer hunting. Later, in 2006, to protect their property during a larger wildfire, they set back fires that nearly trapped BLM firefighters. These actions led to charges of arson, and after a lengthy legal battle, the story of the Hammonds spread across the entire ranching West. It reached Ammon Bundy, a figure in Arizona, who took up the cause and led the takeover of the Malheur Refuge. The Bundy family has a long history of high-profile disagreements with federal managers. In 1993, Cliven Bundy, Ammon's father, refused to sell his grazing permits back to the federal government as part of a land swap deal. In an act of defiance, Cliven Bundy refused to renew his grazing fees, eventually accumulating more than $1 million in unpaid fees. The BLM, determined to capture and impound the trespassing cattle, sent federal officials to confront Bundy. The result was a standoff. Armed militia members faced off against over 100 federal agents, including 24 BLM enforcement officers. In a surprising turn, the BLM relented and returned to cattle, choosing de-escalation over confrontation. Such standoffs are exceedingly rare, but the intense and heated disagreements over federal land policies are anything but fringe. It's not just the armed ranchers who feel aggrieved by the BLM. Entire states, like Utah, have a history of pushing back against federal policies. For example, the Clinton administration's designation of the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in Utah effectively halted much of the state's plans for land development, including roads and infrastructure in the area. This battle continues across the country. In western Colorado's Thompson Divide, a coalition of ranchers, recreationists, and environmentalists protested the BLM's oil and gas development policies until, in 2020, the Trump administration responded by relocating the BLM's headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Grand Junction, Colorado. For some, this was a win, primarily ranchers and oil and gas developers. But for environmentalists and outdoor enthusiasts, it was a setback. As the BLM continues to navigate these choppy waters, it faces growing criticism from all sides. The BLM's role is unique in that it has to balance competing interests. It doesn't have the clear mandate that other agencies do. For example, the Department of Defense (DoD) has a straightforward mission: land for military use. Though controversial, especially in places like Hawaii, where military land takes up a significant portion of the state's landmass, the public largely understands the purpose. Similarly, National Park Service (NPS) land is clearly meant for conservation and recreation, which has helped the NPS build a strong public coalition. The agency manages iconic locations like Yellowstone and Yosemite, and in a Pew Research poll, it received high favorability. 76% of Americans view it positively. On the other hand, the Fish and Wildlife Service's mission is also one of conservation, focusing on protecting wildlife rather than human use, which has garnered it broad support. It's not immune to controversy, though, most notably due to disputes like the one with Elon Musk's SpaceX, whose Starbase facility adjoins protected wildlife land. But the agency's conservation efforts are popular, ensuring it escapes the levels of controversy faced by the BLM. The Forest Service, another agency managing resources, is often seen in a more favorable light. Its mission blends resource use with conservation and recreation, and its core work, forestry, aligns better with conservation than, say, oil and gas drilling. Moreover, the Forest Service has become a symbol of American values, with iconic figures like Smokey Bear ingraining the agency into the national consciousness. But the BLM is different. The problem with the BLM is that it's tasked with a nearly impossible mission. It must simultaneously please ranchers, recreationalists, environmentalists, and oil and gas developers. The issue lies in the fact that many of these groups' needs are mutually exclusive. For example, grazing often leads to the overuse of land that environmentalists want to protect, while oil and gas drilling clashes with conservation goals. So, the BLM ends up disappointing everyone. Ranchers argue that it doesn't protect their grazing rights enough, while environmentalists say it favors ranching and resource extraction. As a result, the BLM operates in a perpetual state of tension, with no clear public coalition supporting it. It faces criticism from both sides of the aisle, leading to undermined resources and support. It's tasked with managing America's most empty, unutilized land, the vast open West. Yet the agency is constantly torn between the needs of competing interests. This is America's worst land. Yet the agency in charge of it is stuck between an impossible rock and hard place, facing endless criticism and no realistic path forward.